Welcome back to Dark Horror Stories. In today's episode, I'm sharing 10 deeply unsettling stories from places that were never meant to be visited. Forgotten trails, collapsed hollows, sealed cabins, and stretches of wilderness where something old and wrong has been waiting for a very long time. These are accounts from people who wandered too far, stayed too long, or simply made the mistake of going somewhere they were warned against. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Story 1. There's a stretch of the Ochoko National Forest in central Oregon that doesn't appear on any trail map I've ever found. I know because I've looked. I spent the better part of 3 weeks after I got home trying to locate it on satellite images, on old survey maps from the county records office, even on one of those Forestry Service databases that lists logging roads and fire breaks from the 1940s. Nothing. Either the place doesn't exist on paper, or someone made sure it wouldn't. I was 29 when I went up there. A friend of mine, Darren Okolo, who I'd known since we were both doing seasonal work at a ranch outside Prineville, had mentioned it maybe a dozen times over the years. He'd grown up about 40 miles east of there, and he had this way of referring to that section of forest the way people refer to a scar, not with drama, just with a specific kind of quiet that you notice. He never said don't go, he just never offered to come with me. I drove up on a Thursday in late September. I remember it was a Thursday because I'd had a dentist appointment that morning and I almost canceled the whole trip when they found a hairline crack in one of my back molars. I didn't cancel it. I wish I had, though I couldn't have told you why at the time. It was just a camping trip. A couple of nights in the woods to decompress after a rough month of contract work that had gone badly sideways. The drive out on the Forest Service road took longer than I expected. I kept stopping to check my phone's GPS, which had stopped updating about 6 miles back and was showing me as a gray dot hovering over nothing. The road itself was fine, packed gravel, a little overgrown on the shoulders, but nothing my truck couldn't handle. I had a full tank, 2 days of food, a water filter, and a rain tarp I'd had since college that smelled faintly of mildew no matter how many times I washed it. I parked where the road dead-ended against a berm of old slash piles and started walking. The trees here were ponderosa mostly, big ones, their bark the color of rust and vanilla. I remember noticing how quiet it was, not peaceful quiet, just absent. No jays, no squirrels rattling in the undergrowth, none of the usual chatter a forest makes when it's alive and doing what forests do. I told myself it was the time of year, the cooling temperatures driving everything into its winter behavior early. That made sense. I held on to that. I set up camp in a small clearing about 2 miles in, got a fire going, ate a mediocre meal of instant rice and canned chili, and watched the sky go from orange to purple to black. Nothing happened that night except that I slept badly and woke twice with the absolute certainty that someone was standing just outside my tent. Both times I unzipped the door and shone my headlamp around and found nothing. Trees, brush, the dead fire. I told myself my body was adjusting to the altitude. The next morning, Friday, gray and cold, with low cloud pulling through the treetops like smoke, I packed a day pack and went exploring. I wasn't following a trail, there wasn't one. I was just moving through the trees, compass in hand, planning to make a loose loop and end up back at camp by early afternoon. About 40 minutes out, I found the first thing. It was hanging between 2 ponderosas, maybe 20 feet off the trail I'd made for myself through the brush. A bundle, maybe the size of a shoebox, wrapped in what looked like burlap and bound with cord. There were other things attached to the cord, small objects I couldn't quite make out from a distance. I stood there for a good while deciding whether to get closer, and eventually I did, because I'm exactly the kind of person who does that. They were teeth. Not animal teeth. The shape was wrong for that, too flat, too squared, arranged along the cord with some kind of care I couldn't quantify. I didn't touch the bundle. I stood there with my hand half raised, and then I let it drop and I took several steps backward. I told myself someone had been up here doing something, a weird campcraft project maybe, or some kind of joke meant for whoever happened this way. People do strange things in the woods. I'd seen stranger. I took a different route back toward camp. That afternoon I found the second thing, which I hadn't been looking for and which I'm still not sure how to describe. There was a section of ground near a dry creek where the soil was disturbed, churned up, almost tilled in a rough oval maybe 15 feet across. At the center of this oval, pressed into the dirt as clearly as a mold, was a shape. Hands and knees, like something very large had been kneeling there. The impressions were deep and the edges clean, and there were no other marks. No footprints approaching the oval, none leaving it. Whatever had knelt there had appeared at the center of that patch of earth and gone back to wherever it came from by the same impossible route. I stood at the edge of the oval for a long time. I could feel my heartbeat in my throat, and I was doing that thing where you're very carefully not thinking about the obvious implication of something, not letting your brain go to the conclusion that's sitting right there. I turned around and went back to camp and started breaking it down. I was taking the tent stakes out of the ground when I heard it, my name, in Darren's voice, coming from the trees to the north of my camp, maybe 60 yards out. Just my name, spoken at normal volume, conversational, like he was a few feet away and about to say something else. I didn't call back. I don't know why some instinct clamped my mouth shut before I could. I just crouched next to my tent and stayed very still and listened. It didn't come again. I packed faster than I've ever packed anything. I didn't run, but I walked to my truck with everything I owned in one load, throwing things into the bed, and I drove out of there with the headlights cutting through the late afternoon shadows and both hands rigid on the wheel. Darren, when I called him that evening from a gas station in Prineville, had been at his sister's place in Boise for 5 days. He hadn't been anywhere near those woods. 3 days after I got home, I found something in the outside pocket of my day pack that I hadn't put there. A strip of bark, pale and dry, maybe 5 inches long, carved into its inner surface so lightly you almost missed it, was a handprint, smaller than mine, fingers too long for the palm. I threw it in the dumpster behind my apartment building. I checked the pocket again that night. There was another one. I haven't gone back to Ochoco. I don't talk to Darren much anymore either, which isn't his fault. But sometimes on the phone, when he starts a sentence and pauses in the middle of it, that half-second of silence before whatever he was going to say, I think about that voice in the trees, and I say I have to go, and I hang up. Story 2. My grandmother's property sat at the end of a county road in the hill country of central Texas, about 20 miles north of where anything worth naming actually exists. The nearest town, and I use that term generously, had a feed store, a post office the size of a bathroom, and a diner that was only open Tuesday through Thursday. I used to love visiting as a kid, that particular flavor of nowhere that feels like the whole world fell away and left just the land and the sky and whatever was between them. She passed in February of the year I turned 32. She left the property to me and my cousin Priya, which surprised both of us since we weren't the cousins who'd kept in touch with her. We weren't unkind about it. We just weren't present, and people usually leave things to the people who showed up. Maybe that should have made me think harder about why she'd done it. It took us a while to get down there to start dealing with the house, probably 2 months, maybe a little more. Priya drove up from San Antonio. I flew in from Portland, and we met at the property on a Wednesday in early April. The house was fine. Old, dusty, the refrigerator full of things that no longer had any relationship to food, but structurally fine. It was the land around it I wasn't prepared for. My grandmother had owned 40-some acres. Most of it was cedar and live oak rolling back from the house in every direction. and somewhere on the western edge of the property there was a dry creek, and beyond that, according to the deed, an old stock pond that hadn't held water since the 90s. Priya wanted to walk the boundary. She was always more outdoorsy than me. She'd done trail races, camped alone, all of that. I was more of an indoors person. I told her I'd come anyway. We started early, maybe 7:30. The morning was cool and bright, cedar waxwings going through the buried trees, the grass still wet. I was wearing shoes that were completely wrong for this, low canvas things that soaked through almost immediately, and I'd forgotten my sunglasses in the rental car, which I was annoyed about in a very small, ordinary way that I think about now with a kind of tenderness. Those were my biggest problems that morning: wet socks and no sunglasses. The western edge of the property was further than we'd expected. We'd been walking maybe 40 minutes when the cedar got thick and dark. The branches interlocked overhead, so you were moving through green shadow even in full morning light. The dry creek was there, just a bone-white cut in the earth, and we crossed it easily. The pond was another 10 minutes beyond that. It was dry, as the deed said, just a depression in the land filled with cracked gray mud and a few dead shrubs. Nothing remarkable. Priya was taking photos on her phone for some reason I forgot, documenting the property maybe, or just keeping herself occupied. I walked around the edge of the pond and tried to imagine it full of water and found I couldn't quite manage it. The whole area felt wrong in a way I couldn't locate, not threatening, just subtracted from, like something had been removed from the air. That was when Priya stopped walking. I looked back at her. She was standing at the far edge of the pond, looking down at the cracked mud. Her phone was at her side. "Come look at this," she said. Her voice was level. Priya was always level. I went and looked. Something had been in the mud recently after rain had softened it and before the sun had baked it back to concrete. The impressions were of feet, but bare and long, the toes spread wide, the arch barely present. What made me take a step back was the gate. Whatever this was, it had walked into the center of the pond and then simply stopped. No turn, no reversal. The prints just ended mid-stride at a point roughly in the center of that dry depression, and the mud beyond them was undisturbed. Priya said, "Animal, maybe." I said, "Sure." I didn't believe it. I could tell she didn't either. We didn't talk much on the way back. I kept checking behind us, not anxiously, not yet, just that restless habit of looking over your shoulder, and the trees were always just trees, nothing there. The cedar waxwings were still moving through the branches. Normal sounds, normal light. I had almost convinced myself that I'd been dramatic about the footprints when I noticed the first marker. It was tied to a cedar trunk maybe 30 yards from the house. A bundle of dry grass, knotted and folded, with a flat river stone placed on top of it. I stopped and looked at it. Priya stopped beside me. "Was that here when we went out?" she asked. It was, I was certain. There were 3 more between there and the house, spaced at irregular intervals, each one slightly different, a different object placed on top, a different kind of grass or vine used for the binding, but all of them new. All of them with the stone on top, which I kept coming back to, because stones don't grow on cedar trees in the hill country. Someone had carried them there. We went inside and locked the door, and I remember very distinctly that Priya put the kettle on and we sat at my grandmother's kitchen table, and neither of us said the obvious thing, which was that those markers had not been on the property that morning, and the property was 40 acres of dense cedar with no road access except through the gate we'd both driven through and left locked behind us. The night was fine. Nothing happened. We took turns sleeping, not because we'd discussed it, but because neither of us could sleep for more than a few hours at a stretch, and when one of us was up, the other one drifted off. Around 3 in the morning, I was sitting at the kitchen table with the lights on, listening to the house settle, when I heard something on the porch, not footsteps, more like weight shifting. Slow and deliberate, A creak and then silence and then another creak further along, as if something was moving the length of the porch very slowly, testing it. I didn't open the door. In the morning, the porch was empty. I looked, and I would have been fine. I think I would have rationalized it into nothing, except that there was a place near the porch steps where the wood had been touched. On the underside of the top step, in the gap between the boards, tucked there, left there, was a single cedar waxwing feather, still bright, still perfect, like a calling card. Like something making a point about what it knew and when it had been watching. We sold the property. We didn't tell the realtor anything. I think about that and I'm not proud of it, but I also don't know what we would have said. We just sold it cheap and fast to a developer who was going to clear it anyway. I still dream about that dry pond sometimes. The prince stopping in the middle. That last step, mid-stride, and then just the flat gray mud in all directions, undisturbed. Story 3. I've done offshore work most of my adult life. Supply vessels, crew boats, a stretch on a seismic survey ship that was genuinely the most boring year I've ever had. I'm comfortable on water in a way a lot of people are. I don't spook easy. I say that because I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you isn't a nervous person misreading a dark night on the ocean. I've been in bad situations at sea. I know the difference between weather and bad luck and something else. This was something else. The job was supposed to be straightforward. 3 of us, me, a woman named Soledad Fuentes, who I'd worked with twice before and trusted completely, and a guy named Russ Kempley who was new to our crew but came well recommended, were hired to do a condition survey on a decommissioned oil platform in the Gulf of Mexico. The company that owned it was going through some kind of drawn-out regulatory process, and they needed documentation of the current state of the structure before they could proceed. Get out there, photograph everything, take measurements, fill out forms, come back. 2 days. Simple. The platform had been inactive for 11 years. I want to say that again. 11 years with no crew, no maintenance, no human presence. Just sitting out there 60 miles offshore, rusting and collecting pelicans. We arrived early morning on a day in August that was already hot before 8 o'clock. The Gulf sitting flat and colorless under a white sky. The approach was easy enough. The platform was smaller than I expected, a 3-deck structure on 4 legs, the lower deck about 30 feet above water level. The access ladder was corroded but functional. We went up. The first deck smelled like rust and bird droppings and something underneath both of those, something organic and what I couldn't source. Soledad made a comment about it and I agreed it was bad, and we both moved on and didn't discuss it further. The equipment on the first deck was what you'd expect after 11 years of salt air, gauges cracked, hoses stiff, anything painted a uniform orange-brown. I photographed everything methodically. Russ was on the radio, logging our check-ins with the supply boat that would return for us the next morning. We found the first thing around 10, maybe 10:30. In one of the storage lockers on the second deck, a steel box, shoulder height, welded shut on all sides except the front panel. Someone had been keeping something. The panel was ajar. Inside, in the back corner, there was a nest. Not the rough, improvised kind seabirds build. This was precise. Woven from wire insulation and nylon cord, shaped into a tight dome, packed with a soft material I didn't want to look at too closely. It was big. The interior diameter was maybe 18 inches. I photographed it and stepped back and told myself a large seabird had gotten in there somehow and built it. That was possible, technically. I moved on. The second deck had a small control room, a sleeping cabin with 4 berths, and a mess area with a table and 2 benches bolted to the deck. The sleeping cabin had been used. Not recently, the mattress covers were stiff with age and salt, but recently relative to the timeline. Someone had stripped 2 of the 4 berths of their covers and piled them in a corner. On the wall above the stripped berths, at a height of maybe 4.5 feet, something had scratched marks into the paint. Not writing, just lines vertical, counted in groups of 5 the way you track days. There were a lot of groups. Russ said someone was living out here. I said, looks like. Soledad didn't say anything. She was looking at the marks, counting under her breath. She got to about 230 and stopped counting and left the room. I followed her. We didn't talk about it. That night, sleeping in the mess room because none of us wanted the sleeping cabin, I woke up at some point in the dark to a sound that was, at first, just the platform. Metal structures in open water make constant sound, groaning, ticking, the slap and wash of the sea below, all the mechanical respiration of a thing built to take punishment. You filter it out or you learn to, but there was something else underneath those sounds that I couldn't filter. A rhythm, slow and deliberate, coming from below us, from the first deck, or maybe the water itself, like something striking the platform leg at long intervals. Not the sea was still. This was a single impact, and then a pause, and then another impact, patient and calm, roughly every 40 seconds. I got up and went to the rail. The first deck was below me and lit dimly by the overnight running lights we'd left on. The sea was 30 feet further down, black and nearly flat. I looked for the source of the sound and found it. Below the waterline, or rather, moving up from it, climbing the platform leg, was a shape. I only saw it for a moment before it moved into shadow, but in that moment, in the flat yellow light, I saw shoulders. Pale and very broad, wet, the muscle beneath moving in a way that wasn't right, not the smooth rolling movement of a person climbing, but something articulated differently, like the joints had one extra option available to them. The hair, if it was hair, was matted flat against the skull. The skull was large. That's what I keep coming back to when I think about it, the size of the skull. I did not call out, I did not go down. I went back inside and I woke Soledad and I woke Russ and I told them what I'd seen. Russ thought I was confused from sleep. Soledad looked at my face and didn't argue. We spent the rest of the night in the control room with the door dogged shut, taking turns sitting up. I heard the sound 3 more times, the same patient interval, the same single impact, and then nothing. At first light, Soledad went down to the first deck with me and we looked at the platform leg where I'd seen the figure. The lower rungs of the ladder had been there before we arrived, but 3 rungs about 20 feet up had been bent. Not broken, bent, the way you bend something deliberately, gripping it and pulling the metal off true. It would have taken enormous force, or weight, or both. We were off the platform by 8:30 that morning, 3 hours before the supply boat was scheduled. When the boat captain asked if we'd finished the survey, I told him yes. I sent in the documentation later that week, which wasn't complete, and I billed for only 1 day, which the company questioned. I told them there had been weather. I don't do offshore work anymore. I have this, I know, as something I can point to, a practical reason, a career change, something that makes sense in conversation. But the truth is that what I think about at night isn't what I saw climbing that leg. It's the marks on the wall, all those groups of 5 lines, all that careful counting by whatever was out there of however many days it had been waiting. Story 4. You grow up in a town like Gatlinburg and you get pretty good at ignoring the mountains. That sounds wrong, but what I mean is, when you're 12 miles from the most visited national park in the country, you stop seeing the Smokies as anything extraordinary. They're just the backdrop, the thing behind everything. My family had lived in Sevier County for 4 generations, and by the time I was old enough to drive, Great Smoky Mountains National Park felt about as mysterious as my backyard. That was my mistake, I think, not the trip itself, the assumption underneath it. I was 19 the summer this happened. My friend Leanne Vasquez and I had decided to hike out to a backcountry campsite we'd gotten a permit for, 3 miles past the main Alum Cave Trail turnoff on a spur route that doesn't get a lot of foot traffic. Leanne was a year older than me, studying environmental biology at UTK, knew plants and rocks, and could identify animal sign like a person twice her age. She was the person you wanted in the woods. We started late. That was the first bad decision. We'd slept in, gotten breakfast at a diner in Gatlinburg, spent time in the parking area organizing gear. By the time we hit the trail, it was almost noon. We had permits for a site that was supposed to be a 3-hour walk-in, which would put us there by mid-afternoon. That was fine, that was reasonable, except the trail conditions slowed us down. Not dangerously, just soft ground after recent rain, some blowdowns across the path that needed navigating, one section where the trail itself had washed out and we had to find our own route for about a quarter mile. Leanne had her trail map, a real paper one, and she was good with it. I was carrying most of the food weight and was slightly ahead of her most of the way, keeping pace. It was around the 3-mile mark that I noticed the smell. A dense, wet animal smell, nothing I could identify exactly, not decay, not a skunk, nothing I had a category for, just presence, if that makes sense. Like something large had recently been in an enclosed space and the air still held the fact of it. I stopped and waited for Leanne to catch up, and I asked her if she smelled it. She did. She said bear maybe, and I nodded, and we both got our bear spray accessible and kept going, slower now, talking more than we had been. The conventional wisdom is noise keeps bears at a distance. We followed that wisdom. The site was there, empty, exactly where the map said it would be. We set up camp quickly, ate early, got the food bag hung well before dark. Leanne was in good spirits, identifying some lichen formation on a rock that she said was unusual for this elevation. I was enjoying the company and the cooling air and a general sense of the day having worked out fine despite the late start. At some point after dark, I'd already been asleep, so I couldn't say exactly when I woke up to Leanne shaking my shoulder. She was sitting up in her sleeping bag with a headlamp on, looking at the tent wall. "Listen," she said. I listened. There was something walking around our tent. Not quickly, not crashing through brush the way a startled bear does. This was deliberate, measured. A step, then a pause, then another step, and the footfalls were heavy enough that I could feel them faintly through the tent floor. Whatever this was, it was big. I said bear very quietly. Leanne shook her head. Her face in the headlamp was careful, neutral. She'd looked at animal track in mud all her adult life. "Too slow," she said. "Bears don't walk that slow." We stayed still. We didn't make noise. The thing, whatever it was, completed a full circuit of our tent over what felt like 10 minutes, but was probably 3 or 4. Once, passing the tent's side panel nearest me, it paused. I was watching that wall the way you watch something about to move, and in the pause I heard breathing. Low and nasal, unhurried, so close I could have reached through the fabric and touched it. Not bear breath, not deer, something else. The smell was back, that dense, wet, enclosed thing, rolling through the tent walls like it was looking for gaps. Then it moved on and the footsteps continued and then faded and stopped. Neither of us slept. At first light I went outside and Leanne came with me and we looked at the ground around the tent. The soil was soft from the previous day's rain and it had kept perfect impressions. There were tracks, 5-toed, plantigrade, deeply pressed. Not bare, the toe arrangement was wrong, the heel fall too heavy in a different pattern. Not human exactly. The size was approximately human, but the spacing was wrong. The stride too wide, the impression of the ball of the foot pressed in a way that suggested weight distributed differently than any person I've ever stood next to. Leanne stood over one of the clearest prints for a long time without speaking. We broke camp. We walked out faster than I've ever walked any trail in my life, not running, but moving with the focused intention of people who have made a decision and intend to maintain it. We didn't talk much. At one point on the trail, maybe 2 miles from the trailhead, I looked back out of habit and saw something at the edge of the tree line behind us, standing still. Too tall at the distance I was seeing it to resolve into details, just a vertical shape, pale in the shadow at the edge of where the trees began. I turned forward and kept walking and I didn't look back again. When we reached the parking area, Leanne sat on the tailgate of my truck for a while without getting in. I stood beside her. She had her phone out and she was looking at photographs she'd taken of the tracks before we left. She looked at them for a while and then she put her phone in her pocket and she said, "I don't know." And I said, "I know." And that was the whole conversation. She texted me about a week later. "I went through everything I know. I can't account for the tracks. Please don't ask me again. I haven't." Story 5. The house in the Cascades had been in my family for 30 years before I ever spent a night there alone. My uncle Goran Vezic had built it in the 80s on 6 acres of forested land outside a small town in the foothills of Washington state. Not the dramatic high Cascades, just the dense, wet, western slope forests that go on forever in all directions and swallow light even at midday. He'd used it as a hunting cabin mostly, and after he died it sat empty for several years while my cousins argued about whether to sell it. Eventually they stopped arguing and asked me to winterize it and assess whether the structure was worth keeping. I was the family member with carpentry experience, and I was between jobs, and it seemed like a reasonable way to spend a week in November. My partner at the time, Tobias Reinhold, offered to come up for the weekend in the middle of it. I was glad. The house had a way of making me aware of how far I was from anything. The first few days were straightforward. I repaired gutters, checked the crawl space for moisture damage, replaced some rotted sill plates, ran the wood stove to evaluate the flue. The house was livable, cold in the way old houses in wet climates are always cold, pulling it from the ground up but not structurally compromised. I was falling asleep early, waking up when the stove needed feeding, eating canned soup, reading. It was the most solitude I'd had in years. The woods around the property were right up against the house on 3 sides. My uncle had never cleared a perimeter, just built in among the trees, and the result was a place where daylight lasted about 3 hours in November before the angle of the sun dropped behind the ridgeline, and the shadows came out from under the firs and just accumulated until there was nothing else. On the 3rd night, Wednesday, I think, or maybe Tuesday, I woke up around 2 with the absolute certainty that I wasn't alone in the house. Not a noise, not a movement, just that knowledge, sudden and complete, the way you sometimes know before you know. I lay still and I listened, and the house was quiet except for the stove ticking as it cooled and the rain on the metal roof. After a while, I sat up and turned on the bedside lamp and looked around the room. Nothing there. I got up, went through the small house room by room, lamp in hand, opened the bathroom door and the closet door and the door to the little back room my uncle had used for storage. All empty. I was almost back to bed when I noticed the back door wasn't fully latched. I'd been careful about doors the whole trip because of the weather. I distinctly remembered checking that door before I went to sleep. I shut it and latched it and went back to bed. I didn't sleep well. In the morning, the porch outside the back door had something on it that hadn't been there the previous evening. A pile of animal bones, small ones, cleanly stripped, arranged in a pattern I tried not to look at too long. Not scattered, placed. Whatever had put them there had taken time. Tobias arrived Friday afternoon, and I hadn't told him anything about the bones because I'd moved them with a stick into the tree line on Thursday morning and told myself it was a coyote cache or something equally reasonable. He arrived loud and cheerful and with good wine and better food, and his presence was such a relief that I nearly cried. We made dinner, talked for a long time, went to sleep early. It was after midnight when Tobias sat up next to me in bed and said my name. I came awake fast. "Something S on the roof," he said. I heard it immediately. Not an impact, not the punctuated thuds of a branch or an animal jumping. This was movement, continuous and paced. A weight shifting across the roof from the back of the house toward the front, slowly, with a rhythm that had nothing accidental about it. Whatever was up there was walking. The metal roof carried the sound perfectly, every foot placement precise, and I could track its progress as clearly as if I were watching it. It reached the peak of the roof above us and stopped. The silence after that was different from the silence before. Occupied, I could feel Tobias beside me not breathing, both of us looking up at the same invisible point on the ceiling above our heads. Something tapped the roof. Once, directly above our faces. Then again. Then 3 times in quick succession. And then, worse than anything else, the movement resumed back the way it had come, toward the back of the house, retreating, and after a moment, nothing. We left at 6:30 that morning. We didn't finish breakfast. I filed a brief report with my cousins telling them the structure was sound and recommending they sell. They sold it the following spring to a couple who intended to use it as a short-term rental. I thought about warning them. I wrote the email 3 times and deleted it 3 times. What I remember most, the detail I can't file anywhere comfortable, is the tap directly above our faces, because the roof was metal, and whatever was up there had tapped with something that was not a fingernail, not a knuckle, not any sound a human hand makes on metal. It was a dry, hollow sound like wood on wood. And the spacing of the 3 rapid taps, I have clapped my hands in that rhythm compulsively over the years, trying to match it to something normal. I have never once managed to reproduce it naturally. The middle tap was too close to the first one. The interval before the third was too long. It was wrong in a way that your body registers before your brain does. I still flinch sometimes when it rains on a metal surface. Story 6. The summer I was 34, I took a job managing a backcountry trail crew in northern Minnesota, up near the Canadian border in the Superior National Forest. I want to say up front that I'd done outdoor work for almost a decade by that point: trail maintenance, wilderness survey, 2 seasons doing habitat restoration in Montana. I was not someone who got spooked by the woods. The woods were my job. They were mostly fine. I had 5 people on my crew that season. I'm only going to tell you about Annika Thorson and Dominic Lalland because they were with me for the part that matters. The others had gone back to the base camp that day for a resupply, and Annika and Dominic and I had stayed at a trailside site to get ahead on clearing a section of Blodon before the wet weather came. The Superior hiking trail runs for 300 miles through a landscape that looks in places like it was designed specifically to be disorienting: dense boreal forest, an infinite repetition of spruce and birch and black water, every ridge and lake looking more or less like every other ridge and lake. In the part of it we were working, the nearest marked trailhead was about 8 miles back. The nearest road was 12. We'd been there 3 days when the weather changed. Came in fast, a front rolling down from Ontario, and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in about 4 hours. We got everything secured, the gear tucked, the tent guylines tightened, and spent the afternoon huddled in the cooked tent eating soup and talking about nothing consequential. Dominic was teaching Annika gin rummy. I was reading a worn paperback I'd found at the trailhead parking lot box. It was actually comfortable. That's what I keep coming back to, how ordinary those hours were. I went to check the gear tarps around 7. The light was going quickly under the cloud cover, and I took my headlamp. I was back by the tent maybe 3 minutes when Annika came to the tent door and said, "Cowan, come listen to this." I went and listened. From the direction of the ridge above our site, maybe 300 yards up the slope, though sound carries strangely in forest, something was calling. Not a loon, not a wolf. I know both those sounds intimately after years of northern work, and this was neither. It was high and sustained and had a quality that I can only describe as deliberate, not a mating call, not a territorial call, not any of the functional noises animals make for clear biological reasons. It rose and fell on a pattern that suggested something different, something more like language. "Coyote," Dominic said. He was at the tent door behind me. "No," Annika said. She had her eyes closed, listening. That's not a coyote. The call stopped. Silence for a few minutes. Then it started again, closer. I was certain it was closer, not dramatically, maybe 50 yards, but enough that the volume and the quality of it had changed, and we all heard the change and we all knew what it meant. We went inside the tent. The call moved. Over the next 40 minutes in the dark, it described a loose arc around our campsite, always in the trees, never in the clearing, stopping and resuming at irregular intervals. I tracked it by sound, and I kept telling myself it was a bird I hadn't encountered before, an animal I didn't know. My unfamiliarity was the problem and not the call itself. Annika had her notebook out and was writing the intervals down because she was that kind of person, scientific, documenting, keeping her hands busy. Dominic had found his camp knife and put it in his pocket and hadn't said anything about it. The call stopped completely around 9 and didn't resume. We stayed up until midnight. Nothing. At first light, I did the thing I always do and went to look. I followed where I believed the sound had been along the ridge edge, and I found, about 300 meters above camp, a tree, a birch mid-sized at the edge of a small rocky outcropping. The bark on the tree had been stripped from a section about 8 feet up to about 4 feet up, a long pale wound on the white bark recent, the cambium still slightly damp. This wasn't unusual by itself. Deer strip birch bark, bears do too. What was unusual was what had been placed in the stripped sections hollow. A nest of sound. That's the only way I can think to say it. Packed into the gap between the stripped bark and the tree's heartwood, tight and compressed, was a mass of material, feathers mostly, dozens of them from a dozen different species, and woven through them a substance that might have been dried plant fiber or might have been something else, pale and filamentous, and in the center of all of it, lodged like an egg in a nest, a stone. Smooth, about the size of my fist. And that stone, when I touched it, because I touched it, which is not something I'm proud of, was warm. Not ambient warm, not sun-warmed. Warm the way a living thing is warm from inside. I left it where it was. I didn't tell Dominic and Annika what temperature it had been. I told them it was just a bird cache and we broke camp and moved on. Annika's notebook, which I saw briefly over her shoulder before we packed up, had the intervals of the call written out. She turned them into fractions, doing some kind of mathematical analysis in her own time. I didn't ask what she'd found. I still wonder. Story 7. The Salt Flats out near Wendover, Utah are one of those places that do something to your sense of scale. I don't know how to explain it to someone who hasn't stood on the Bonneville Flats at dusk. The way the horizon is so flat and so far that the light seems to come from everywhere, the way the silence isn't quiet but is instead this crushing presence, the way your body keeps looking for vertical reference points and finding nothing but the distant mountains which are too far away to be useful to your perception. I loved it. I want to make that clear. I drove out there every year for the better part of a decade, sometimes alone, once with an ex, a couple of times with my old college friend Marcus Acampon, who shared my interest in landscape photography. It wasn't a dangerous place to me. It was a place I understood or thought I did. The year I was 36, I went in October alone for 3 nights. I had a specific project, a long exposure night photography series I'd been planning for 6 months. I'd done all the logistical homework, checked the weather windows, got permission for a vehicle camping spot about 12 miles out from the main road. I packed for the desert temperature swing, which is vicious in October, plus 80 in the afternoon, below freezing by 3 in the morning. I had everything I needed. The first 2 nights were perfect. No clouds, minimal moon, the Milky Way so clear I had to recalibrate my exposure expectations. I shot until my hands got too cold to work the controls comfortably, and then I got in the car and ran the heat and went back out. Good work. The kind of focused quiet I'd been needing. The 3rd night the wind came up. Not dangerous wind, just steady and cold, maybe 20 miles an hour, enough to make long exposures difficult and to make me feel the size of where I was. I set up my shot anyway, a composition I'd had in mind since I arrived, and I was waiting out the wind when I saw the light. Far out on the flats, maybe 2 miles north of where I was, it was hard to judge distance out there. I've already mentioned the scale problem. A light was moving. Low to the ground, slow, no visible source. Not a vehicle. The flats don't allow vehicle travel off the designated areas out that far, and a vehicle would have a different light profile anyway. This was a single light, pale and slightly blue-tinted, about the brightness of a camping lantern, moving in a way that I kept trying to reconcile with a person walking and kept failing to, because it was too slow. Even walking carefully in the dark across salt flats, a person moves at a certain pace. This light was doing something closer to a shuffle, maybe 50 feet per minute, drifting rather than purposefully moving. And it was drifting in a direction that I watched on my compass over the next 20 minutes, due south, directly toward where I was sitting. I started to rationalize. Geological something, methane gas maybe, though I knew that was more of a swamp phenomenon, a drone, a weather balloon, a trick of my cold and slightly exhausted eyes. I packed my tripod and got in my car. I sat in the car with the engine running and I watched. The light continued. In an hour it had covered maybe half the ground between where I'd first seen it and where I sat. I was parked on the flats with nothing between us but 2 miles of flat white salt, and I could feel, in a way I'm still not comfortable examining, that whatever was carrying that light knew exactly where I was. I drove back to the main road with my headlights on. When I checked my rear view at the edge of the flats, there was nothing to see. The darkness behind me was total and without reference. The light was gone, or had gone dark, or had stopped. I was loading my car the next morning in full daylight when I noticed my driver's side door. There were impressions in the dust that covered the paint. The car had been coated in a fine white salt dust for 3 days, pressed into the surface as clearly as fingerprints in wax. Long-fingered marks, smeared slightly as if they'd slid before finding grip, arranged along the door frame as if someone had been trying to find a way to open it from the outside. There were 8 of them, 4 on each side of the door handle. I took a photograph before I got in the car. I've never posted it anywhere. I've looked at it regularly for 5 years, trying to find an explanation that holds up. I haven't found one. Story 8. The valley locals called the sink isn't on any map I've found, but you hear about it if you spend any time in the rural counties of Western Virginia, in the kind of conversation that drifts toward it like water finding a drain. My neighbor, an older woman named Betty Colgrove, who had lived in the county her entire life, mentioned it once in passing when I was asking about trails for hiking. She said it matter-of-factly, "Don't go down in the sink." She was talking about something else 15 seconds later and she never brought it up again. I should have asked her more questions. That's not the first or last time I've thought that. I went the following spring on a Saturday with no particular plan except to see what was there. I was 31, I'd moved to the county the previous year for a remote technical writing job, and I was still in that phase of new place living where everything feels like a discovery opportunity. The sink was, as best I could determine from satellite images and some old county survey data, a collapsed karst formation, a depression in the limestone plateau maybe a half-mile across and 30 feet deep at its center, heavily wooded, accessible from the ridgeline above by a faint social trail that someone had been using enough to keep visible. I went down on that trail on a cool morning in April. Fiddleheads coming up, red buds still holding some flower, the light green and diffuse. I had my camera, a small pack water lunch. I was thinking about nothing important. The sink was immediately strange in a way I noticed but couldn't immediately explain. The temperature dropped as I descended. That wasn't surprising, cold air pooling in a depression, but the drop was more than I expected, and with it came a smell that I recognized from somewhere and couldn't place. Sweet and faintly ferrous, not unpleasant, just wrong for the context. The trees at the bottom were different from the trees on the ridge. Same species, oak and hickory mostly, but the growth pattern was off. Trunks twisted in long, slow spirals that weren't disease, not that I could identify. Branches reaching down instead of up on some of them, which happens but usually has a cause. No cause was obvious here. The undergrowth was thin and the soil was pale, almost gray, and when I crouched down and touched it, the texture was wrong, too fine, too dry for a sheltered hollow in April. I walked to the center of the sink, which took about 10 minutes, and took photographs and ate half my lunch and sat on a fallen log and felt genuinely that I was somewhere that didn't agree with my presence in the way a healthy place does. Not threatening, more like visiting somewhere that operated on a slightly different set of rules and was tolerating you the way a careful host tolerates an unexpected guest. I was heading back toward the trail when I found the well. Not a dug well, this was a natural formation, a hole in the limestone about 3 feet across, perfectly circular, as if the rock had been bored rather than broken. No fence, no cover, no indication it had ever been marked. I shone my phone light down into it and saw about 10 feet of shaft and then nothing. The light stopped making sense at the bottom the way it does when something is absorbing it rather than reflecting it. From the hole, very faintly, came a sound. I'm going to try to describe it accurately because I've spent years turning it over. It was tonal, regular, like a very slow, very patient counting or humming or both at once. It had a depth to it that suggested the shaft went much further than 10 feet. And it was oriented. I mean, the sound was directed. It came from the hole with intention, and when I crouched at the edge, the volume increased in a way that had nothing to do with acoustics and everything to do with the feeling that whatever was making it had become aware of my face above the opening. I stood up. I stepped back. The sound continued at exactly the same volume and pattern, utterly indifferent to my movement. I walked back to the trail at a pace that wasn't quite running, and I climbed out of the sink, and I kept walking until I was on the ridgeline with the valley floor visible in one direction and the county road visible in the other, and I stood there for a while just breathing. 6 days later, I ran into Betty Colgrove at the hardware store. I told her I'd been to the sink. Her expression didn't change, but her hands stopped moving on whatever she'd been looking at. She looked at me for a long moment. "Did you go to the bottom?" she asked. I said yes. "Did you hear it?" I said yes. She nodded once very slowly. "Don't go back," she said, "and don't think about what you heard. Don't try to figure it out. Don't describe it to people." She picked up what she'd been looking at and put it in her basket. Some of what's down there is old enough that our understanding of it is a kind of invitation. I have tried very hard to follow that last piece of advice. I am failing at it right now. I don't entirely know why I keep telling this story. Maybe it's because 3 weeks after that conversation in the hardware store, I found gray soil, the distinctive gray, fine soil from the sink, in a trail of small deposits leading from my back door to the edge of my property. I hadn't been back to the sink. The soil had come to me. Betty moved away from the county that winter. I don't have her contact information. I've thought many times about what it means that she left after 20 years there, and that she left that same autumn. Story 9. I want to be careful about how much detail I give about the exact location here, because the people who live near it are still living near it, and some of them are still working the land. And I don't think drawing attention serves anyone. I'll say it was in the hill country of northern New Mexico, not far from where the Jemez and the Sangre de Cristos come close enough to make the valleys between them feel cupped and hidden. My name is Paloma Reyes, and I was doing ethnobotanical fieldwork for a university program, plant documentation, collection, geographical reference data. Dry work mostly, beautiful country, extremely long days, a lot of solitude. I had a field vehicle and a campsite permit on BLM land and permission from a family whose private land bordered the study area to cross their property as needed. The family's name was Sandoval. The old man, Eduardo Sandoval, had given me permission over the phone and told me to stop by when I arrived. He'd been polite and brief. When I stopped by the day I arrived, he came out to the truck and looked at me for a moment and said, "You planning to go all the way up to the arroyo at the north end of the property?" I said yes, that was within the study area. He nodded slowly. He had the particular deliberateness of a person who has said a thing many times and given up on it being heard. "That far north," he said, "there's a place where the canyon wall cuts back and makes a kind of room. A hollow. You'll smell it before you see it, like old copper. Don't go into the hollow. Don't look at what's in it. If you hear something that sounds like your name from that direction, keep moving." Then he went back inside. I sat in my truck for a moment and then drove to my campsite. The first week of fieldwork was uneventful. Beautiful, actually, Pythian and juniper giving way to ponderosa at higher elevation, late wildflowers, the particular quality of New Mexico light that makes everything look like it's already been photographed. I collected specimens, logged coordinates, worked methodically south to north through the study area. I was happy. I reached the northern section on the 9th day. The arroyo was there as described, a wide sandy wash cutting along the base of a mesa, the canyon walls reddish and striated, the vegetation thicker because of the water table. I was working slowly, careful with the fragile soil, photographing everything. It was late morning, good light, no wind. The smell found me before I'd consciously noticed I was near the hollow, old copper, exactly as described. And beneath it something else, sweeter. That made me think involuntarily of the inside of a closed room where something was growing. I stopped and looked around, and there it was, a cut in the canyon wall 30 meters ahead where the rock had slumped or eroded to create a recessed space, shaded, maybe 20 feet wide and 10 feet deep. Even from where I stood, the air around it was different, slightly cooler, the light inside it slightly darker than the angle of sun should explain. There was something moving in there. I couldn't see it clearly. In the shadow at the back of the hollow, there was movement, slow, repetitive, the way something moves when it doesn't know it's being watched, a rocking motion. I stared at it and the shadow stared back, and I could make out a shape very roughly, something pale and low to the ground, and the motion was rhythmic in a way that made my chest tight even before my brain had processed what was wrong about it. The hollow made no sound. Whatever was moving in there was silent. Utterly, deliberately silent. I started walking south, parallel to the arroyo, eyes forward, at a pace I was controlling carefully. I was 40 meters away when I heard my name from the hollow. In a voice that was mine, my pitch, my accent, the particular way I pronounced the hard L, but emptied of everything a voice should have. The content was there. The person was not. I ran. I won't pretend I didn't. I ran south along the arroyo for what must have been a quarter-mile before I stopped and made myself breathe and made myself not look back. I could feel, with certainty that had nothing to do with vision, that nothing was following. Whatever was in the hollow stayed in the hollow. Eduardo Sandoval had said something about that, a place with boundaries implied. Maybe it was true. I completed the fieldwork south of the arroyo over the following 3 days, and then wrote up what I had and submitted it as a preliminary report, and told my advisor I needed to move the study area. She was surprised. I told her about access issues. That was easier than the truth. What I found when I got back to my campsite that last night when I was packing my field case was my voice recorder, a small digital unit I carried for specimen notes, sitting open on my camp table. I had not taken it out of the case that day. I had not been to the hollow with it. But when I picked it up and checked the memory, there was a new recording. 43 seconds dated that afternoon. I'm not going to tell you what was on it, not because I'm being dramatic, because the specific quality of what I heard on that recording, the rhythm and the sound and the complete absence in it of anything that should be familiar, is not something I intend to put into words or share or think about more than I have to. I deleted the file and I deleted it from the trash and I threw the recorder in the arroyo. I drove south and I didn't look at the canyon wall when I passed the hollow. I looked anyway. The rocking motion was still there. Story 10. I'll tell you the last thing first, just so you understand what kind of story this is. When I finally made it back to the road, the county road, asphalt, real and solid and lit by the early morning gray, I sat on the shoulder for almost an hour before I could get up. Not because I was hurt, because my hands were shaking so badly I couldn't trust them to hold me, and I needed to be still for a while, and I needed the road under me, something ordinary and flat and made by people for people. I'm still not sure why I went up there in the first place. That's the honest answer. I was 24 and I had a week off between finishing my master's and starting the job I'd taken in Seattle, and I was in that particular state of needing to do something significant without having anything significant to do. My older brother Dak Tran had mentioned, maybe a year before, that there was an old fire lookout tower deep in the North Cascades that had been decommissioned in the 70s and was technically still on the maps but not maintained and not patrolled. He'd gone up once years ago with a college friend. He said the view was incredible and that you could stay the night in the cab if you wanted, which was technically not allowed but also not enforced because no one ever went there. I drove up on a Sunday, took the trailhead at the end of a Forest Service road, signed nothing, told no one exactly where I was going. That last detail I'm not proud of. The hike-in was 9 miles on a trail that went from decent to faint to essentially nothing as it climbed, and by the time the lookout tower came into view on its rocky summit ridge, I had been walking for 5 hours and my water situation was less comfortable than I'd planned. The tower was still standing. That was more than I'd honestly expected. A standard cab on stilts design, 4 steel legs, an exterior catwalk, the small square cab perched at maybe 50 feet. The wood was grayed and checked and the stairs were missing 3 treads, and when I climbed up I had to test each step carefully, but I made it. The cab had 1 door that opened and 1 window on each wall and 4 decades of initials carved into every surface. Someone had left a folding chair. There was a wasp nest in 1 corner that was old and papery and empty. I sat in the folding chair and ate what was left of my lunch and watched the Cascades in all directions turn gold in the late afternoon. It was spectacular. I'm not going to pretend it was. I have a photograph from that window on my phone, the view to the north, ridges receding into haze, and I still look at it sometimes and feel the thing I felt then, that specific bigness, the world going on without you in every direction, nothing between you and the horizon but air. I decided to stay the night. I had my sleeping bag, enough food, enough water to manage. I could be down and back at my car by early afternoon the next day if I started at first light. I ate dinner in the darkening cab, watched the stars come out through the east window, and fell asleep in my sleeping bag on the floor around 9, which was the earliest I'd gone to sleep since I was a child. I woke up at some point in the deep middle of the night. I didn't check my phone. I wish now that I had, to a sound from below the tower. From the stairs, not the creak of the structure in wind. The stairs. Each tread ascending, each one carrying weight, each one followed by the next in a sequence that was unmistakably something climbing. I lay in my sleeping bag and I counted the steps by sound. I had counted 11 on my way up, accounting for the missing treads. Whatever was on those stairs was passing the missing treads without pause, no hesitation, no adjustment, no deviation in rhythm, as if it didn't need the physical surface to climb. The counting stopped. I knew from the sound and the silence that followed that whatever it was had reached the platform at the top of the stairs and was now standing directly outside the door. The door handle moved, slowly. The full rotation of the mechanism, a deliberate test of whether the latch was engaged. I had locked it, an old barrel bolt that I'd found on the inside, and slid home out of habit, not out of any expectation that I'd need it. I stared at the bolt from inside my sleeping bag and watched it hold, and I was grateful for it in a way I've never been grateful for anything. There was a sound against the door, not knocking, pressure, the wood flexing slightly inward, as if something very heavy was leaning against the outside of it, testing the door the same way it had tested the handle, slowly gathering information. Then it moved. Along the exterior catwalk that wrapped the cab, I could track it by sound. Around the south wall, around the west wall, pausing at each window, and at each window the ambient light, the faint starlight coming through the glass, was eclipsed. Whatever was out there was positioned against each window, blocking it, and it was large enough to block the window completely. At the north window it stopped. I could see the shape of it in silhouette against the glass from where I lay. The proportions were wrong for a person. The head was too wide and too flat at the top, the shoulders too far out from the body, the overall shape suggesting bulk and density rather than height. It didn't move for a very long time. I lay on that floor and I watched its outline against the north window, and it stood there, and I could feel, and I know how this sounds, I know that it was doing the same thing, watching me, waiting for me to do something. I didn't move. I have no idea how long this lasted. Eventually the silhouette was gone. I heard nothing on the catwalk after that. I heard nothing on the stairs. At first gray light, I opened the door and I went down the stairs as fast as I could move, and I started walking south on the trail without looking back at the tower. 3 miles down I stopped to catch my breath, and I looked back up the ridge, and the tower was visible from there, just barely, a dark vertical against the sky. There was nothing on it. The catwalk was empty. I found something in the outside pocket of my pack that evening when I got back to my car. A piece of wood, smooth, about the size of my palm. I hadn't put it there and I didn't know when it had gotten there. On one face of it, carved with something fine-pointed and careful, were 2 circles side by side, close together. The right size to be eyes if you were the right size. I kept it for almost a year in a drawer in my Seattle apartment before I finally threw it in the bay. I looked at it most mornings, the way you circle a thing you're trying to understand. I never understood it. But standing on that bridge, dropping it in the water, watching it disappear, that was when I finally stopped dreaming about the north window, about that silhouette, about the patience of something that can stand outside a locked door in the middle of the night at 50 feet elevation and simply wait. Maybe it's still up there. Maybe it was always up there. Maybe the reason the trail went faint and the tower got decommissioned had nothing to do with budgets or staffing, and the real reason is something the Forestry Service decided a long time ago was better left alone. I think about Dak's college friend sometimes, the one who went up there with him. I've asked Dak twice what that friend's name was and where they are now. Both times, Dak went quiet in the way he does when he doesn't want to say something. Both times he changed the subject. Thanks for spending time with these stories tonight. If they got under your skin, and I hope at least one of them did, hit that like button and subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. Drop a comment letting me know which one stayed with you the longest, and if you've been somewhere you probably shouldn't have, I'd genuinely love to hear about it. Share this with someone who appreciates a good scare. Until next time, stay on the marked trails and pay attention when the locals tell you not to go somewhere.